And it's my great pleasure.
Okay. Got it.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me officially open the meeting, and it's my really great pleasure to introduce to you Ambassador Danielem Mulhallem. And I will, because his CV is so impressive that I need a couple of slides to back me up in that introduction. So I'm going to try and do that. Justyna, one participant could share at the time. Again, something is happening.
No, it should be everything
Okay.
okay.
Yes, everything is okay now. Right. Yes. So the meeting is devoted to the newly published book of our guest, Pilgrim Soul, William Butler Yeats and the Ireland of his time. But as I said, we do have a guest who has an incredible diplomatic career, ambassador to Malaysia, United Kingdom, and your last posting, United States, 2017-2022. All of these postings were really in quite an interesting time. And I've read, this is, by the way, taken from Harvard School of Politics. So this is an official biography. And where you mentioned some of the really important diplomatic moves during these said postings. So our guest was part of the Irish government's delegation at negotiations culminating in the Good Friday Agreement. Guys, yes, look at that. This is just absolutely incredible, that brought peace to Northern Ireland. Then US posting during the referendum on leaving the European Union, during which he was active in highlighting the negative implications of Brexit for British-Irish relations and for Northern Ireland. Then the Department of Foreign Affairs in Dublin as press spokesman and Director General for European Affairs. And since retiring as ambassador, he has been Global Distinguished Professor in Irish Studies at Gluckman Ireland House, New York University, and Parnell Fellow at Magdalene College, University of Cambridge, and is currently a consultant with the law firm DLA Piper. He's also a writer, and just a couple of covers. We're going to talk in more detail about Pilgrim Soul, as I said at the beginning, but this one is also, of interest to most of the scholars and students of Irish literature and culture, and of course the previous works concerning history and the history of Ireland in relation to its culture and literature. And because we prepared this nice little poster, this is part of our series, Irish Literary Geographies. So here it is, a poster that was advertising today's meeting. And nothing would have happened without the embassy. I don't know if Ambassador Patrick Howie is with us. Yes, he might be. So I'd like to welcome Ambassador Howie, and also thank him for the contact with our today's guest, Danielem Mulhallem. And of course, this is all Justyna's doing. I had nothing to do with it, but we were reading William Butler Yeats' poetry at the Warczyński Library on November 14th, 2023, so a date when the Nobel Prize was announced. So an important date for all of us, but of course an important date to celebrate William Butler Yeats and his work. And that's it. With that, welcome all of you. And of course, you've already met Justyna, who is our who's my co-organizer from the Irish Culture Foundation. And I think I saw Krzysztof Schramm, the Vice Honorary Consul, Irish Vice Honorary Consul here in Poznan, and also welcome. And we work together on a number of projects, and I'm glad that we can meet today and enjoy our conversation with Danielem Mulhallem. And with that, I'll pass the microphone to Justyna.
Thank you very much, Liana. Thank you so much for your time. I know you are extremely busy promoting the book, and you were in Sligo last week for events in Yeats Sligo Society. I traced some of and watched some of the events online, and the book is absolutely amazing. It's really worth recommending, and I love how you incorporate Yeats's verse and quotation into your writing. So it's so authentic, it's so alive, and I think that you reach the goal. And this is the book perfect for the people who loves Ireland and loves Yeats, but for the people who just don't know what to do with it and would like to learn more and would like to start their journey with Yeats and with the Irish history. So congratulations from, I think, both of us. We are in love with the book, and we are so happy that we can ask a few questions about it. So,
happy to answer your questions. As long as you have, I'll be here.
Okay.
As long as you have to spare, if you have time to spare, I've got things I can do to fill that time. Thank you.
Well, we definitely will have more questions that we prepared, but we were trying to limit ourselves concerning your busy time. Well, our third series of literary online lectures is called Irish Literary Geographies. So we basically travel around Ireland with literature and its authors. So we will be in Belfast, we'll be in Ireland with Sing, we'll be in Dublin. We've already had a meeting dedicated to Seamus Heaney. But your book takes us on a journey as well. And it's a journey through life, of course, of William Butler Yeats and his works, but as well around your diplomatic posts all over the world, as Liliana mentioned. And I would like to ask you, in your opinion, which place shaped Yeats the most? Is it House in London, at Blenheim Road in Bedford Park when he saw Maud Gonne for the first time? Is it Sligo, like one of the major tourist attractions for Ireland, the Yeats County? Is it London? Is it Dublin? Or maybe it's just the Yeats inner words? What do you think?
That's a very good question. It's a bit like last week when I was in Sligo, I was asked the question, who's better, Yeats or Joyce? And I was really struggling to answer that question. So I had to kind of, plead the Fifth Amendment and, say that both of them were brilliant in their own way, and that Joyce represented the kind of anti-heroic tradition in literature, whereas for Yeats, it was always heroism that attracted him. I got away with that answer. I mightn't get away with it on every day, but on the day in question, nobody jumped up to attack me for my heretical views. So with regard to obviously the sense of place is very important in literature. With James Joyce, it's Dublin, 100% Dublin. Yeats was much more mobile than Joyce. Well, of course, Joyce was mobile, but not in his literature. His literature was all set in Dublin, whereas he himself, of course, moved around Pola, Trieste, Rome, Paris, and then with some side trips to various places in Europe during his lifetime. Yeats was more mobile in the sense that he had a number of homes that you could say influenced him very strongly. Sligo, obviously very important because of the his childhood there and the early influences on his poetry, and indeed even later on the poems about the Gore Booth sisters, the light of evening, Lissadell, great windows open to the south, two girls in silk kimonos, both beautiful, one a gazelle. So he was drawn to Sligo in many ways, and of course ultimately he decided that his bones should rest in Sligo under Ben Bulben at Drumcliff Churchyard. So clearly Sligo plays a major part in Yeats's life, and I'm the honorary president of the Yeats Society, so I have a bias, I suppose, in favor of Sligo as a sort of an inspirational place for W.B. Yeats. London, it was a place where he professed never to be happy there, but he spent a lot of time there. So he can't have been that unhappy. And he obviously experienced a lot of the literary life of London, was experienced in the salons, the great literary salons of London and the country houses where Yeats was a welcome guest. But he was always in a way fighting against London, as Irish people often tend to be. You know, we tend to be never quite at home in London. We've always got a bit of an argument with, with London. And I think that was the case with Yeats, who did have a degree of what you might call Anglophilia, even though he spent so much time in Britain. And then Dublin, I think, so my answer to the question really is, and by the way, there's a fourth place which you could mention, which would be Cool Park in County Galway, the home of Lady Gregory, where he wrote some of his great poems, and indeed the Tour Ballylee, where perhaps some of his greatest poems were written, the poems that appear in the Tower and the Winding Stair. So, but what I would say is that it was inspired by Sligo and made in Dublin, because it was in Dublin that he became an Irish writer. And becoming an Irish writer was the fundamental decision that Yeats made, which shaped the rest of his life.
Thank you. Juliana?
Thank you. Yes, in both of these books, one of the truly amazing aspects of both of them is that you show your personal involvement with both Yeats and Joyce. I'll leave Joyce for now, although I did love the book, I have to say. But with the Pilgrim Soul, you kind of show how Yeats was always part of your diplomatic life, and how you entered his poetry and how it traveled with you in a way through all these different postings. For me, I had a different road to Yeats, so to say. I'm not going to talk about myself, but the question is, if you could think of the young readers, people do not really want to read poetry unless we make them, and we do make them, but if they would want to return to Yeats, what would you suggest? How would you suggest they see Yeats, and what they start with to get hooked on Yeats?
Well, there are two sides to Yeats. In a way, Yeats is two writers in one, because you have the late romantic writer of the 19th century who wrote The Lake Galavinish Free and When You Were Old, and he wishes for the clouds of heaven and so forth. And probably my favorite one is the Song of Wandering Aengus, which is a beautiful poem which has got some wonderful musical tones, but also has very powerful imagery, the glimmering, become a glimmering girl with apple blossom in her hair and so forth. And then, of course, those wonderful last two lines, and walk through long dappled grass and touch and till time and times are done, the silver apples of the moon, the golden apples of the sun. So that kind of poetry is kind of magical. It's mysterious, because it's not poetry that lends itself very easy to fully understanding where the beauty of that poetry comes from, and why it's the more successful late romantic poem than other poems written at the same time by other writers who had their own talents but didn't quite match the lyrical power of W.B.H. So that's the first bit. So I would say, if you had to ask me for a recommendation there, I would recommend The Song of Wandering Aengus. And you could make a movie about that poem. It's a wonderfully evocative poem, both in terms of its musical power, but also the visuals that are, the images that Yeats throws in front of us are very powerful indeed. And then if you go to the later poetry, what attracted me to the poetry of Yeats was Yeats as a witness to history, because I was a historian studying history, but also literature, and I had to decide at one stage which road I would go down for my master's, and I decided to go down the history road, but I couldn't quite leave literature behind me. And so I came up with the idea of studying history through the lives of William Butler Yeats in particular, but also of his contemporary George Russell, who was not as good a poet, but was a much more, a much more influential figure in many ways in the Ireland of his time, because he produced very high quality weekly journalism for 25 years of his life, and this was, of course, very damaging to his ability to be a good poet, because he didn't have time to spend in crafting his poetry. But nonetheless, so I studied. My master's thesis was about those two writers in particular, and I looked at the way in which you could trace the various issues that arose in Irish public life in the first 4 decades of the 20th century through the lives and works of those two writers, William Butler Yeats and George Russell. So if I had to recommend a poem for the latter part of Yeats's poetic life, I think I would recommend Among School Children, partly because it was set in my own hometown of Waterford when Yeats was a senator, and he was visiting a school in Waterford. Mind you, the exact school he was visiting is hotly contested. There are two groups of nuns, the Mercy nuns and the Ursuline nuns, both of whom claim that the poem was inspired by their school. I haven't been able to find any decisive proof, though I have a reference in one of Yeats's letters to meeting a wonderful Mercy nun in the south of Ireland. It doesn't say it's Waterford, but Waterford would be in the south of Ireland. So I would say that sort of tips the balance slightly in favor of it being the Mercy school in Waterford, where actually, as it happens, my sisters went to school, my mother went to school, and my aunts went to school. So it's a school that I know very well. But the great thing about that poem is that you've got a very matter-of-fact first stanza where he talks about walking through the long schoolroom, questioning, and the nun in her white habit, and the children doing their lessons and staring in momentary wonder upon a 60-year-old smiling public man. And that's, of course, what Yeats was at that time in 1925. But then he goes on to a philosophical rumination, finishing off with, are you, O chestnut tree, great rooted blossomer, are you the leaf, the blossom, or the bowl, O body swayed to music, or brightening glance, how can we know the dancer from the dance?
Yes.
So if you want a poem that has substance, lots of substance in it, but yet has that lyrical quality nonetheless, I think you can't go much further than Among School Children. And for me, at least, one of the great achievements of Yeats is that he was creative to the very end of his life. And some of his greatest poems were written in the last year of his life. I'm thinking of the Municipal Gallery Revisited, so I mean, and poems like that, or the Circus Animals Desertion. These are great poems that were written really when Yeats was a dying man. So that ability to be creative throughout his life, to me, is one of Yeats's great achievements. And to go from being a romantic poet in the 19th century to being a modernist poet in the 20th century, while at the same time retaining that great lyric gift that he always had.
And being Yeats, simply because you can still recognize the poetry and the poet, and so this is an imprint that hasn't changed. Right, thank you very much, Justina. Your turn.
Well, I think we both had a feeling while reading your book that we are traveling with you side by side, through your diplomatic posts, and your experience you shared in the book in Germany, the United States, and India and Australia, and showed how Yeats is popular. And his words are current and modern. And how would you explain this huge popularity of Yeats poetry all over the world, including Poland? Like last year, we had 2 new Polish translations of Yeats poetry, which is, amazing. And we are very happy about it. And we all know, of course, it's a great poetry. But it has to be something more than just great poetry that allowed us to comment, for example, like current political situation in Yeats' words. Like Second Coming during pandemia was something which appeared like...
I know, it's extraordinary. And also, my friend Joe Hassett, who's a great Yeats scholar, a lawyer in Washington, D.C., who's written about Yeats and Joyce, he wrote a piece about the lines from A Stare's Nest by My Window. We are closed in and the key is turned on our uncertainty. And he said, when the COVID pandemic came, you could have, those words summed up the entirety of humanity. We were all closed in for months and months on end, and the key was turned on our uncertainty. We were living on our own with our families, our close families, and we were dealing with the uncertainty. We didn't know how long was this going to last. We didn't know how serious it was going to be, how deadly it was going to be. All these things were playing on us hugely. And therefore, Yeats's words. So the great power of Yeats's words is that they travel. I recently taught at Harvard University's Institute of Politics. That was my last academic role before I came back to Europe there last week. And there I taught a course called when things fall apart, can the center hold? Which had nothing to do with W.B. Yeats, except that I was inspired by Yeats's words to teach a course about why the center has come under so much pressure around the world over the last 10 years in the United States and in Europe. And my students, I actually read the poem to them. And honestly, even though they were all in their late teens, early 20s, they, I think, saw that poem as a contemporary of theirs. And I think it's Yeats's ability to extract himself from his Irish setting, which is very powerfully present in all of his poetry. His power is to extract himself from that setting and to write in ways that communicate fundamental truths. For example, to go back to that poem, The Stairs Nest by My Window, where you have, we have fed the heart on fantasies, the heart's grown brutal from the fair, more substance in our enmities than in our love, come build in the empty house of the stair. So, those comments about there being more substance in our enmities than in our love, those are sentiments that don't just apply to Ireland in the 1920s when they were written, but have a kind of a universal significance, a bit like the lines which I love from Ulysses about forced hatred, history, all that. That is no life for a man and a woman, but it's the opposite of that that's really life. And he means love, the opposite of hatred. So I think the power of these writers is to say things that are of general human relevance rather than being stuck in the moment, as some poems can sometimes be.
I had the chance to take part in a lecture organized by National Library of Ireland just recently, I think a week ago, and the speaker was Professor Geraldine Higgins, and she gave a list
I know Geraldine.
of quotations from American politicians.
Yes.
Yeats in different situations.
Well, Joe Biden, Joe Biden is a major Yeats fan. He quotes Yeats all the time. Indeed, he was criticized in Britain on his first visit to an army base in Britain. He quoted from Easter 1916, which some people in Britain thought was a somewhat unsatisfactory, unsuitable poem. But what he was talking about was, the idea of all change utterly. He was making the point that the world had changed around us and that we have to deal with a newly changed world. In fact, President Biden's speechwriter once said to me, have you any other Irish poets you could give me? I have to wean the president off of Yeats because he quotes him every single time he speaks. So, but I never managed to find anyone in the Irish canon that could quite compare with Yeats as a source of quotable quotes.
Sort of quotable quote. Right. So history and poetry. And this is a question for the benefit of our second-year students. And I wanted to show you something with your audience. This is a notebook. We used to, when I was a student, we used to write notes in these notebooks. And this is my notebook from my student times. And my very first introduction to William Butler Yeats, and of course, The Second Coming. This is the first poem that we read in a class, and that poem was then connected with the study of Joseph Conrad. And of course, we can't really escape from Joseph Conrad here in Poland, and also in any course on literature in English. And so the question is, yes, Yeats' history and poetry, but at the end, or towards the end of his life, he was involved in what I would call the Roger Casement case.
Right. Yes.
So the question is, what is it? He's one of the ambiguous figures in history. Well, Conrad for one thing, but of course his links with Ireland. And so what's your take on the Casement file, the Casement story, especially in relation to the 1936 letters and Yeats's rage against them? And of course, he wrote poetry. So what do you think about?
Well, I think this has all got to do with the fact that the central event in modern Irish history was the Easter Rising of 1916. And it also became a central moment in the life and work of William Butler Yeats, because in 1913, when he wrote that great but angry poem, September 1913, Romantic Ireland's dead and gone, it's with O'Leary in the grave. In other words, he appeared to be almost packing his bags and setting off as far as he could get away from this, what he called the fool-driven land, and the people that were not willing to accept the great genius of John Millington Synge. So you had a very embittered poet writing some very nasty pieces of poetry condemning the ordinary people of Dublin for not being sufficiently artistic to be able to embrace Synge, and also to support the idea of building a municipal gallery to host the pictures that had been, or the paintings that had been donated to the people of Dublin by Lady Gregory's nephew, Hugh Lane, who died drowned on this Titanic. So Yeats was at a point where he was turning his back, it seemed, on Ireland. And I had the Easter Rising not taken place, I wouldn't be surprised if Yeats might have ended up, kind of accepting maybe a role as a poet laureate in Britain, maybe accepting a knighthood. The poet laureateship was available to him, so was a knighthood. He didn't pursue either of those options. So the Easter Rising came along, and as it did for many Irish people and many people around the world, it was a kind of a bolt from the blue. Nobody expected it. It happened overnight, and the kind of the outcome of it was obviously the defeat of those who had taken over the centre of Dublin in 1916. But in the longer term, a transformation of Irish politics and a moment of change in Irish history. And Yeats cottoned on to what was happening right away. I mean, not everybody in 1916 would have said all's changed utterly. Many people thought that after the war things would go back to the old ways, and the experienced politicians would come back in and take over, and they would negotiate some kind of settlement with Britain following the war. That didn't happen, and Yeats spotted that fact very early on. Within months of the Rising, he realized things had totally changed because of the sacrifice of those who had fought and died in the Easter Rising. So turn the clock forward 20 years and more to the mid-1930s. Yeats is still writing about the Easter Rising. He's still writing about it. I mean, not only does he write, I mean, he has this line, did a play of mine send out certain men the English shot, wondering if his play Kathleen Ní Houlihan, first produced in 1903 with Maud Gonne playing the role of Kathleen, the personification of Ireland, if that play had actually been part of the background to the Easter Rising. And then he wrote a poem about the O'Rahilly. The O'Rahilly was a fairly obscure character who actually tried to have the Rising called off. He traveled around the country to call the Rising off, and then came back to Dublin and decided that he had sounded the alarm and he had to go in and fight, and he was killed in the last days of the Rising. And in 1936, Yeats wrote a not particularly brilliant poem about the O'Rahilly, but nonetheless, he was still preoccupied with the Easter Rising. And the same is true about Casement, because Casement was this enigmatic figure. After all, for those who don't know the Casement story, he was a British consular officer who was decorated for his work in the Congo, where he exposed the atrocities of the Belgian Empire there, and for his work in Latin America, where he exposed the terrible treatment of some of the native tribes in the Amazon jungle. So he was a heroic figure, you would say, one of the first global human rights campaigners. And then he came back to Britain. He retired from the British Foreign Service and became a fervent nationalist. Ended up in Germany trying to raise support for the Easter Rising from the German Empire during the First World War. He eventually landed in Ireland in 1916 with a consignment of weapons. Those weapons were intercepted. The German naval officers scuttled the ship so as to prevent the weapons falling into the hands of the British. And Casement was captured, taken to Dublin, sent to London, tried, convicted, and hung. And of course, during the trial, after the trial, when there was an appeal and there was a movement to secure clemency for Casement, the British, released these or showed these diaries to some journalists, the diaries which purported to show Casement was actively involved in homosexual activities, which at that time, of course, were criminalized, in Britain and elsewhere. So, and of course, ever since that time, there has been a furious dispute about the authenticity or otherwise of those diaries. And Yeats's view appears to have been that Casement was a heroic figure, that he had died, and that was fine. He had no problem with that. He made a sacrifice, and that was fine. But he felt that his good name should not have been besmirched in the way that it was. Now, of course, looking at these things today, we have a very different view of Casement, and I still think that a lot of people in Ireland still believe that those diaries were forged in order to undermine the case for clemency for Casement. Though I think the weight of evidence from expert opinion seems to be that they're genuine, but that's by no means universally held. That's by no means the universally held view. So what's fascinating for me is that Yeats in the 1930s was still wondering, trying to make sense of the Easter Rising, including through the enigmatic life and personality of Roger Casement. He also wrote those lines, of course, what stalked through the post office with Connolly and Pierce. In other words, he wanted to know in his last year, what was it that drove these people to do what they did, to take up arms in a hopeless cause, which they must have known was the signing of their own death warrant. What was it that motivated that kind of heroic, sacrificial approach by the leaders and men who fought in the Easter Rising of 1916?
Thank you very, very much. Yes, that's we could go on from there, but Justina has other questions, so let's stick to our plan.
Yeah, just as to Casement, there's a great book by Mario Vargas Llosa about
Confessions of a Celt.
Yeah, highly recommended as well. It's translated into Polish, I think, as Marzenie Celta, so it's worth reading. Okay, I have to admit, I love the rhythm of Yeats' poems, and this rhythm, we can even feel it in Polish translations. In a way, it's not lost completely. And I read that when he was young, he made his family mad by composing his poems aloud, like orally. And like oral tradition of telling stories is such a long history in Ireland. Some of the most of the women poems, for example, as we figure out, is that they were just written in memory, just passed from generation to generation, like the Lament for Art O'Leary, like one of the famous ones. So, do you think Yeats wanted to be heard as well as being read?
Well, I mean. In my book, I have a quote from Catherine Tynan, who was an early collaborator of Yeats. She was a young Dubliner that he met, and they had a very close relationship for a number of years. In fact, when he went to London in the late 1880s, she was his principal correspondent for a couple of years. He wrote copiously to her, and the suggestion he may have even proposed to her, but nothing came of that. And she was a very conventional Catholic, Roman Catholic, and Yeats was anything but conventional in religious matters or other things too. So it would never have worked. So just as well, they didn't get together. But she writes about him. He used to come out. Her family had a substantial house on the outskirts of Dublin, and he used to walk 4 or 5 miles. She said, for a good meal and to sit around the fire and talk about poetry. That was his only kind of, desire. But she also talks about him, or recalls him walking around the house, composing poems in his head, but doing so out loud. So I think for Yeats, the music of the words was an important factor. I mean, he had no ear for languages or for music, but he had an ear for the music of poetry. And I think that was a very important aspect of Yeats's poetry was. And I remember once reading something he said, which is that it took me a long time. Somebody, I think, made fun of him for for the way he recited the Lake Galavinish Free, because he used to recite it in I will arise and go now. And it was kind of almost like a kind of a sort of a banshee, as we call them in Ireland, or almost from the spirit world, this was coming. But he made the point, he said, it took me a long time to find those words and to put them into the right order and to bring the music out in them. Don't ask me to read them as if they're prose. So I think he had a very strong sense of the distinction between poetry and prose. And part of that distinction was that poetry was an art form that could be spoken as well as read. And indeed he did. He had Florence Farr was a very close friend of his and one of his lovers. She was into chanting, so he was very much into that sort of aspect of the poetic arts, the kind of the chanting or the sort of recitation, and also if you think about it, some of the mystical areas that he wandered into would have had a strong kind of element of chant in them as well. So yes, I think the music of the words was for Yeats an important part of the whole story.
And which one of the Yeats poems will you point out as the kind of like a first mature voice of an experienced poet? Because we all love Yeats romantic poems. Like the verse from one of them gave a title to your book.
Yeah,
but in his later poetry, these later poems has a depth which is not present in the early one. Well, that's my opinion. So where or when will you kind of like draw a line between romantic Yeats and this cold-eyed poetic observer of the world and history?
Yeah, I mean, Richard Ellman, when he wrote an obituary of George Yeats, Yeats's wife, when she died in the 1960s, said about Yeats that had he died in 1917, when he would have been 52 years of age, instead of marrying his wife, George Hyde Lees, that he would have been a minor poet with a significant lyrical gift, but not much to say with it. So he draws that line sometime in 1917, where after that, he would argue that Yeats had substance as well as the poetic gift. So the poetic gift was allied to material that was actually worth writing about. I would bring it forward a little bit. In fact, I am inclined to think of Adam's Curse as one of the first Yeats poems that has that kind of modern conversational tone to it. I mean, it has some beautiful lines. I loved you in the old highway of love, but it also has things about bankers and schoolmasters and clergymen, the martyrs all the world. So there's that bit of anger there, allied with the beautiful writing that's more reminiscent of the 19th century. So I would put it sometime in the first few years, in the first 5 years or so of the 20th century. I think Yeats deliberately sought to toughen his poetry to make it more public. I mean, I quote Paul Cullum in the book where he says he met Yeats in the early years of the 20th century. And he said, Yeats was a marked man by both sides in Ireland. Like the Unionists didn't like him because he was this kind of Irish nationalist poet. The Nationalists didn't like him because he was not nationalistic enough. The Catholic Church suspected him. So he was a marked man. But he made a reference to him and saying he was whatever we say about him, he had the aura of a public man. And he said, above all else, Yeats wanted to be a public man. He wanted to be noticed. He didn't want to be a poet hidden away in his garret, writing his poetry in cold conditions and poorly lit rooms. No, he wanted to be out there in society. He wanted to be making waves for himself. And that's what he did throughout his life. So I would say early 20th century, for me, is the turning point between the early Yeats and the late Yeats.
Thank you. Liliana?
Yes, thank you. Right, you've mentioned George Hyde Lees, and of course that makes me think of Yeats's interest in the occult.
Yeah.
because no plays, this is one thing, of course, the poetry, the words, but the occult is something that for me marks his earlier life. And then there's the marriage to George Hyde Lees, yes, and there's the automatic writing, but then what happens afterwards? He seems to be more of a statesman and less a person who is still interested in Madame Blavatsky's Theosophical Society. But perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps there is some of that early life's interest in the occult that is continued, but maybe in a different way.
Yeah.
What's your take on that?
I think I'm not a particular authority on the occult in Yeats. I decided against writing a full biography of Yeats because I didn't want to have to go down that particular rabbit hole trying to understand all the different occult activities that he was engaged in. Of course, his wife was also involved in those activities, and that's probably why she was able to do this automatic writing. Whatever might have been behind it, it couldn't have been done by somebody who didn't know about all of this occult history of Yeats. So in fact, I think he introduced her to the Secret Order of the Golden Dawn, which, by the way, we now might laugh at these things, but in the early 20th century, everyone who was anyone was involved in this sort of stuff. I mean, it was it was of its time, and it was almost like being concerned about the environment now. I mean, the equivalent in 100 years ago was probably being interested in these New Age religions, and I mean, Arthur Conan Doyle was involved. A lot of pretty significant figures in early 20th century and late 19th century literature were involved in the Golden Dawn. So Yeats, I think, for a certain time in his life, got a lot from that kind of activity. He really did, I think, thrive on it, alongside his political activities as well, which were also sort of semi-secret because he may have been a member of the oath-bound Irish Republican Brotherhood. Now, if he was a member, I think it was largely a case because he liked the idea of secret societies rather than because he had any desire or intention of doing anything that might have got him into too much trouble with the authorities. But the British authorities were watching him, and he was, there's a police report that I found somewhere, which talks of him as a minor literary figure that would have appalled Yeats, and also as more or less a revolutionary. So he wasn't, which he wasn't at all, but at least for a certain stage of his life, the occult was a big deal for him. And then I think when he met his wife and married her, the automatic writing consumed years of their marriage. And after he produced a vision, it seems to me that the occult stuff seems to have been put on the shelf as, that's not done. I mean, a vision, which I think most people regard as incomprehensible. I mean, I'm sure there are a few scholars who understand it. I didn't even try to understand it. For me, that's the equivalent. That's the equivalent of Finnegan's Wake for Joyce. It's just a bridge too far for me to try and delve into this stuff. But certainly, it gave Yeats a sense of himself and the world, which seemed to satisfy it. I mean, I found it amazing, as I said in the book, found it amazing that a man in his 50s in 1918, 1920 was saying, oh, I understand the world for the first time. I mean, given all he's been through and given how intelligent he was, it seems strange. But for some reason, Yeats did get a comfort and a satisfaction from his wife's automatic writings and the things he gleaned from those writings. And they, of course, influenced his work from there on in. But the occult itself does certainly go into the background. And what emerges after his marriage to Georgie Hyde Lees went into its kind of more settled phase, he then becomes a sort of an amorous gentleman around London, seeking the company of interesting younger women.
Which you also refused to write about, and there are sentences that you refused to write about.
I said I wouldn't, and then I think I mentioned it in passing.
Yes, you mentioned a couple.
Yeah.
But of course, Yeats and women, a different story.
I mean, Joe Hassett is my guide on that. Joe has written W.B. Yeats and his muses, and he's got into all the relationships, which I didn't really have time to delve into all of that. So I mainly stuck to the Maud Gonne relationship I think was important, obviously, because that was crucial to his connection with Ireland. And then I think Olivia Shakespeare, he wrote some very nice letters, interesting letters to her. He probably should have married Olivia Shakespeare. She was someone that I think would have been a good match for him. She would have been able to she would have been strong enough to cope with him, and I think would have been an interesting person for him as well to be with. But anyway, we didn't go down that road. That was one of the things that was one of the roads not taken, as Robert Frost would have said.
Yes, that's right. Well, anyway, I remember how surprised I was to find manuscripts of Arthur Conan Doyle a long time ago at Brown University. There's a whole occult library at Brown University, and I got lost in the cellar, and it's dark, and these the shelves.
You don't want to be when you have an occult library around you.
This was a really truly occult experience, one that I don't want to repeat. Anyway,
very good.
And that was partly my research into Yeats' story, but it was because of another book. But let's go back to reality, and not the occult, not the ghost, not the no place, but the reality of the 1930s. Well, we know that he was a fierce nationalist, but then there is his, I want to say, a flirt with, unfortunately, with fascism. And then he withdraws because he is so much against Mussolini invading Abyssinia. And now the question is, do you think that's because he was really against the idea of conquest? Or what were the reasons that he was at first drawn to the movement and then just decided that this was not his thing?
Well, I mean, just to say, first of all, that fascism in Ireland was Irish fascism. In other words, the Irish bit was much stronger than the fascism bit, right? So essentially, the short-lived and not particularly influential fascist movement called the Blue Shirts, they were only really a threat to the state for about less than a year, and then they kind of fizzled out. And essentially, the Blue Shirts were part of the backwash from the Civil War that had ended 10 years before. And when De Valera took power, whose party had been defeated in the Civil War, when he took power 10 years later, those who were involved with the previous government thought that they were going to be persecuted by De Valera and his people, so they formed some kind of fascist movement. But it was always a byproduct of the Irish Civil War rather than an authentic fascist movement. Now, Yeats briefly thought, foolishly, of course, that he could influence these people, that he could, his ideas could be influential with this proto-fascist movement that was emerging in Ireland. And he did meet the leader of the Blue Shirts, a man called Ono Duffy. But, within a few months, Yeats realized that these people were not the kind of people that he was hoping would emerge, and would take ideas from him and so forth. Yeats always wanted to be an influential. He always wanted to influence what was going on around him. He always wanted to influence the world around him. And he thought he could do this through being able to influence the emerging Irish fascist movement. When he realized that that wasn't possible, he quickly backed away and he rewrote the marching songs that he'd written. And frankly, if you read them now, it's hard to make any sense of them at all. It's hard. You'd be hard pressed unless you read the notes to know that these were actually written originally as marching songs for the Irish Blue Shirts. And I think also, of course, Yeats, made the fatal error of believing that his kind of Anglo-Irish conservatism, with inspiration taken from Berkeley and Burke and Swift, that was the sort of philosophy that would imbue an Irish fascist movement. Given that Ireland at that time was a 90+% Roman Catholic country, it's clear to me that had there been a fascist movement. It would have been a strongly Catholic dictator along the lines of Franco, rather than somebody who had a kind of an intellectual apparatus of the kind that Yeats hoped to be able to put into the public domain. He thought that his ideas were becoming fashionable. In fact, they weren't. Most people didn't understand his ideas. His ideas, in many cases, don't stand up. The only thing that stands up is his poetry, because the mad things that he put into On the Boiler, which was published in the last year of his death, in the last year of his life, those mad things, by and large, don't appear in his poetry, or if they do, they're well disguised. So I think he was a good editor when it came to his poetry, but perhaps not as good an editor when it came to his activities in the public domain, or indeed, and sometimes in his prose, when he let himself go beyond what I think was sensible for him to say and do.
But it was still, it's still very interesting. It gives you a different perception of fascism altogether. Just to read that part, that you know, here's somebody who can see it in a different way. We in Poland have this kind of really very black and very white version of the movement, and it gives you a little bit more of the gray. And I like the phrase Irish fascism, which it really is an entirely different story. However, and my last question in that part would be, what about the Eugenics Society? What about?
I mean, that was. I mean,
yes.
There's no excuse for that, really. I mean, you know, while I think the fascism you can understand and to some degree excuse, in the sense that in the early 30s, you know, we didn't know then what we know now about exactly what fascism was all about.
Yes, that's right.
You know, being an admirer of Mussolini in the 1920s, as Yeats was, is different from being an admirer of Mussolini in 1938 or whatever, when he was already kind of a fanboy for Hitler. But the eugenics thing is completely inexcusable. Although, again, a lot of sort of intelligent people held those views. You know, I mean, let's be. I've just come from America, and I read a lot about the lost cause, you know, the Confederate kind of, you know, the sort of, you know, the way in which the South, you know, resisted being changed after the Civil War, and they had this redemption thing and the lost cause, and it was all based on really on eugenics. And until the, you know, the 1960s, really, in America, and to some degree even to this day, you have this kind of, you know, racist attitudes of regarding people of color as being somehow lesser people than you know, than those who are white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. But having said that, I still think that you know, On the Boiler, which is the book that we're talking about here, which has the eugenics in it. It was the rantings of a crazy old man who was on death's door, and it seemed to be almost, you know, throwing his toys out of the pram to kind of, you know, how can I shock people even more? You know, I think by that time he wasn't looking to influence anybody. He was looking to be, maybe to be controversial, to be provocative, and I think he went far too far. And some editor should have shaken him. But by that time, of course, he was a distinguished Nobel laureate, and probably no editor would have had much of a chance up against him.
The courage to do that. Well, thank you very, very much. Justyna, your turn.
For the people like yourself and Liliana and myself and many of our guests, like Ambassador Patrick Hochi, and we have some academics working at different universities with us tonight. And we are working with Irish culture on a daily basis. So Yeats was always there and is always there, somewhere in the background. And I'm a historian. I wrote my master thesis about Michael Collins and Irish War of Independence. So probably the first poems of Yeats I read was those dedicated to the history, like Easter 1916 and so on. But I have a feeling as well that, like, my preferences are changing. Like, I'm getting older with Yeats, which I mean that when I started my journey with Ireland and Irish Culture Foundation over 20 years ago, I preferred completely different Yeats poems that I prefer right now. And it's, of course, the life experience and the knowledge you gain on your way that allows you to understand those most serious poems better. But I know after the lecture of your book that you have some poems, like favorites for whole your life. But do you have this feeling as well of changing your preferences as you go? Like when you were 20,
Yes.
did you like the same poems like you liked right now? Do you have this feeling?
Well, I mean, look, I have two sets of poems that I like. The ones I can recite: "The Lake Isle of Inish Free," "When You Were Old," "The Song of Wandering Aengus," "He Wishes for the Clouds of Heaven." I recited those a number of weddings, actually, in America, friends' weddings. I was asked to recite, and I usually recited "The Song of Wandering Aengus," because I think even though it's not a wedding poem as such, it has some beautiful imagery which is relevant to a wedding celebration. So I do, and you know, I first came to love those poems in India, because as I record in my book, on one occasion in 1982, just before the birth of my daughter, we went to lunch with Mrs. Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit, who was Nehru's sister, Jawaharlal Nehru being the first prime minister of India, and I mean, probably one of the most important political figures of the 20th century across the board. And she had been ambassador to the Soviet Union, to the UN, and to the UK and Ireland. But when I met her, she launched into a recitation, word perfect, of "The Lake Isle of Inish Free" and "When You Are Old." And she told me that she had learned those poems by heart when she and her brother were interned by the British during the Indian struggle for independence in the 1930s. So for me, that was an extraordinary awakening to discover that the most powerful Indian family of the 20th century knew our poetry, knew Ireland through our poetry, and felt connected with us because of the work of writers like Yeats and others. So that was my kind of early enchantment with the work of W.B. Yeats, was those early poems. But of course, at college, I very much, you know, used what I call the history poems, you know, going from No Second Troy up to probably Under Ben Bulben, I suppose. You know, you have these history poems, which to me are the greatest achievement of W.B. Yeats. And the fact that most of those were written after he picked up his Nobel Prize is, to me, to Yeats's great credit, because instead of taking a lap of honor and sitting back and relaxing and enjoying the status of being a Nobel laureate, W.B. Yeats set off on this extraordinary journey, which is why I call him a pilgrim soul. He didn't want to just sit there and, you know, bask in the glory of his Nobel Prize achievement. He wanted to push the boundaries and to understand the world around him. And ultimately, his last poems are really about his own life, reflecting back on his own life, his work, his circle of friends and associates, whom he turned into heroic figures, essentially by virtue of the fact that Yeats wrote about them. I remember he wrote about, you know, John O'Leary, his father on the Abbey stage, his mischievous head thrown back, Maud gone at Holt Station. Olympians, all Olympians. Their lives will never be seen again, he said. Well, they're Olympians because Yeats decided to make them Olympian. And I think that's a great achievement, to be able to turn your small, intimate circle of friends and acquaintances into figures that resonate through the history of English language poetry and the poetry of the world this past 100 years.
We've mentioned Joyce somewhere during our talk. So the first literary series of this online lectures that we've organized with both Faculty of English at Mickiewicz University, Ljubljana, and Honorary Consulate of Ireland in Poznan was called Taming Joyce. Mm-hmm. And we organized it around, well, on the occasion, let's say, on second Polish translation of Ulysses by Maciej Świerkocki. So Yeats and Joyce, friends, enemies, how would you describe their relation? Like, we know from your book as well that Yeats did not finish reading Ulysses.
Well, that's my suspicion. I can't say for sure. But he was worried about meeting Joyce a year after Ulysses came out, because he hadn't yet gone very far into the book. And he, you know, when he writes about it, he talks about, you know, the opening pages are wonderful, he says. It has our Irish cruelty. Well, I mean, even the most, the most gentle reader of Ulysses has probably managed to get to the end of the second episode.
Exactly.
So, I mean, it's not a great achievement to be able to write and to analyze the first two episodes of Ulysses. Practically anybody that's taken up the book and probably got at least that far, I mean, it's the third episode that gets most people into trouble with the book, and a lot of people leave it there. And I actually did the first time I started, the book. So look, they were of a different generation, obviously. And if you look at their attitude towards Parnell, for Yeats, Parnell's death in 1890 or 1891 and his fall from power in 1890 was an opportunity to look forward to a new Ireland where culture and literature would play a bigger role, get away from this parliamentary politics stuff and move on to the serious stuff of cultural nationalism. That was Yeats's, in a nutshell, that was Yeats's view of the consequences of Joyce's death. For Joyce's father was a fanatic supporter of Parnell, and in a way, Joyce's father's life went downhill after the death of Parnell. He never recovered. He became this sort of incredibly, talkative but useless character, hanging around Dublin, trying to, touch people for drink. So, and of course, and therefore for Joyce, Parnell was a symbol of the failure of Ireland. For Yeats, Parnell's fall was a symbol of the possibilities that Ireland now offered in the cultural realm. So they had a different attitude towards Ireland. Joyce left Ireland in 1904, and when he was only 22 years of age, and hardly ever came back. He came back 3 times for short visits. The last visit was in 1910. He never came back after that. I've seen his passports in the University of Buffalo's collection. He had a British passport to the day he died, never even bothered to get an Irish passport. I don't think it's because he had any animus towards Ireland. It's just that the Ireland that emerged in the 1920s didn't really interest Joyce because he didn't understand it. He understood the Ireland that he left behind in 1904. He wrote forensically about that. And then everything else about Ireland was of lesser significance to him. Whereas Yeats, from the 1880s onwards, was absolutely obsessed with being an Irish writer. And although there must have been temptations at times to pack his bags and move properly to Britain and abandon this difficult place where so many people had it in for him, he stuck the course. He stayed the course. He never relented in his determination to be an Irish writer. So Yeats was very helpful to Joyce. When Joyce was in great difficulty during the war in Zurich, Yeats managed to get a grant for Joyce from the literary fund, from the British Literary Fund. He used his influence, and that probably enabled Joyce to remain in Zurich and to at least have a reasonable income that he could sustain himself while he was writing Ulysses. When Yeats got the Nobel Prize, Joyce wrote him a very generous message, praising him. I mean, we know that Joyce admired some of Yeats's work. His favorite was "Who Goes with Fergus Now," which has that line, "Life's bitter mystery." And in fact, we know that Joyce loved that poem because it appears in the first episode of Ulysses. It's mentioned, it's quoted there. So Joyce had a lot of time for Yeats, but ultimately Joyce sort of poked fun at Yeats. So in Ulysses, there are references to the mad sisters, Yeats' 2 sisters, who weren't mad. They were perfectly, accomplished, in fact, rather brilliant women in their own way, because they managed to run a business for 30 odd years, which is no small thing to run a craft business in Dublin at that time for that length of years. And then he pokes fun at Yeats as well, in the Scylla and Charybdis episode where he has Buck Mulligan, abuse Joyce for writing a a negative review of a book by that old Hay Gregory. He says, why didn't you have the Yeats touch? Why didn't you do the Yeats touch? The most significant book written in our lifetime, one thinks of Homer, which is exactly what Yeats wrote about Hay Gregory. So he did kind of poke fun at Yeats. And if you look at a portrait of the artist as a young man, he says, Michael Robartes, which is his name for Yeats. Michael Robartes loves the beauty that has disappeared from the world. Me, I'm interested in the beauty that has not yet come into the world. So Joyce saw himself as forward-looking. He saw Yeats as a backward-looking writer that was brilliant nonetheless, but didn't have that modernist ethos that Joyce believed he personally personified.
Well, both Joyce and Shimushini, in Shimushini work, we came across that's called problem of using English in creating Irish literary works. And we know what was their opinion about. We know that Irish English was something familiar, something which already was their own, different from English used in London, which is obvious, right? For anyone which English is not the first language, meeting for the first time Irish person can be a surprise, because this is not the English that we are taught at school. You write actually a lot about it in your book, about Irishness of Joyce, about his approach towards language. It's Gaelic established, and Gaelic idea is to promote Irish as a main language of a nation. So if you can just say, what was Yeats' approach to the problem, case of Irish language?
Yeats, obviously, you do get it in some of his ballads, you get a bit of dialect, you get a bit of Hiberno English, but for the most part, his mature poems are written in relatively standard English. I don't know that there's very much. I know that he uses the word stare's nest, and he actually provides a little. I'd never heard of a stare, but he provides a little note in that to say that a stare is a West of Ireland word for a starling. But apart from that, I struggle to think of any sort of Hiberno-Irish elements in Yeats's later poetry, other than, of course, the place names, which are Irish place names, which he sort of Hibernicizes, or which he anglicizes in a kind of a way that maybe wouldn't be standard, but that's because those words are not standard anyway in English. So there's no great difficulty there. I suppose, the writer, Joyce, of course, does, use the language of Ulysses. The dialogue of Ulysses is the language of the Dublin street in the early part of the 20th century, and there's a degree of Irish dialect there. The one, I suppose, who does most of that would be Sean O'Casey in his great plays, The Shadow of a Gunman, Juno and the Paycock, and The Plough and the Stars, where he does, represent the kind of patois of the Dublin tenement areas, and turns it into, for example, one of my favorite lines from O'Casey, and it's a line that has become more useful in recent years, sadly. It's at the end of Juno, where Captain Boyle and Joxer are drunk, and one of them says, "I tell you what, Captain," this is Joxer, "I tell you what, Captain, the world is in a terrible state of chassis." Chassis, I think, being a sort of being a mispronunciation of chaos, but for some reason the word chassis strikes me as maybe relevant to our present day predicament around the world, where things have gone awry in pretty serious ways, and one hopes that they will come back on track again. But we can only hope and wait and keep our fingers crossed. But so that's where I suppose the dialect is most obvious. So I think Yeats's attitude to the Gaelic League was that he didn't speak Irish, he had no gift for languages, couldn't even learn French, though he spent a lot of time in France with Maud Gonne, and she spoke French, and so did her circle. He didn't really have any gift for languages. Now, he benefited from the Irish language because Lady Gregory did speak good Irish, and so did John Millington Synge. So they certainly gave him, the benefit of their knowledge of Irish was kind of, in a way, translated or transferred to Yeats through their work. But he never had any interest in being an Irish language writer. And his attitude was clearly, he wanted to have an Irish literature which would be Irish in theme and mood and everything else, other than its language would be English, the language that Irish people use for their daily lives in the during Yeats's lifetime and today. Yeats believed that trying to force people or force writers to write in Irish when they weren't really comfortable with the language was never going to result in a good outcome for literature. So Yeats was insistent that that for the foreseeable future, English had to be the language of literature in Ireland. And that was where he came to blows with some of the more narrowly focused nationalists of the early 20th century, a man called D.P. Moran in particular, who ran a crusading newspaper called The Leader and was constantly hammering Yeats for his belief that the Irish language, that the English language could be used to express the soul of Ireland. For nationalists of Moran's type, that was simply not possible. And I suppose the most articulate argument, or the most articulate advocate of the kind of anti-Yeats position would be Daniel Corkery, who wrote a book called The Hidden Ireland, and also a book called Sing and Anglo-Irish Literature, in which he argued that Anglo-Irish literature could not give expression to the spirit of Ireland because it didn't deal with the land, it didn't understand the land, didn't understand the people, and didn't understand nationalism, and didn't understand Catholicism. And for all of those reasons, he basically excluded Anglo-Irish writers. He never actually attacked Yeats personally. I think he kind of realized that Yeats was too big a beast to attack, but he attacked the whole idea of an Anglo-Irish literature. By the way, we now don't use that phrase. I never say, I do sometimes when I talk about historical, but I never say Anglo-Irish literature. It's now Irish literature in English, not Anglo-Irish literature, which is what Yeats maybe would have called it, or what people at Yeats's time would have called it, and for many years after.
Thank you very much. Liliana.
Yes, thank you very much. I just wanted to perhaps entice our audience to ask questions via chat. I'll ask my final question. Perhaps somebody would think of some interesting aspects of Yeats's poetry, or Joyce's Ulysses, or anything that you would like to ask our guest. Right, so, and with that, not a serious question. We've done all the serious stuff about Yeats. Just a question about how we view the past, and whether or not we are allowed at some point to be to look at it with a little wink rather than with awe. So the question is about Anthony Cronin, the poet, a dear friend of the Faculty of English and the Institute of English and the Irish Honorary Consulate, who called his dog Butler, and he openly said that it was to commemorate William Butler Yeats, and he also wrote a poem about it. So what do you think? This is, would you consider that a commemoration or sacrilege?
No, I look, sadly, the fact is that not enough people these days probably read poetry after they leave school. Poetry is a reservoir for me of insights, and it's a way of using language to penetrate things that maybe are more difficult to penetrate using prose. So I think anything that can bring poetry back to mind. And by the way, I tweet poetry every day on my Twitter account at Danielem Mulhallem, and I get great responses from people. People come back to me to say, "Oh, that was my mother's favorite poem. I haven't heard it since my mother used to read it to me." Or people say, "Oh yeah, I remember that from school." So poetry does stay in the mind somehow for many people, but they, I think, purposely try to exclude it because it sometimes brings back painful memories of maybe not so nice childhood school days. But for me, I've always been an admirer of poetry and poets. I have a lot of friends who are poets. I was surrounded by them in Sligo last weekend, the weekend before last, when we had we read 100 Yeats poems in 3 hours. The last 20 or so were done in about 10 minutes, where it was there was rapid fire readings of the shortest poems we could find, because we were determined to get through the 20 poems or the 100 poems in the 3 hours that we had given ourselves. And we did it. We made it by about 4 or 5 minutes. So and there were lots and lots of poets. And in fact, the local poetry circle turned up, and so, look, I mean, poetry is an important part of life. So I think anything that can be done, including calling your dog Butler, I'm all for it. Count me in. Count me in. If I ever get a dog, I now know what to call my dog, okay? After the late Butler, dog of Anthony Cronin, whom I also knew.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
Do you have any questions, please?
What?
So, Justyna and Liliana, if we can just take the chance to dive in. First of all, just to say a huge thank you to Dan for taking the time to join us and for sharing your expertise. That was absolutely fascinating and a pleasure. And let me also thank Liliana and Justyna for organizing this fantastic series of lectures. If I can abuse my position as ambassador to learn from another ambassador, Dan, and ask you, when you've been around the world representing Ireland and presenting Ireland, how have you found Yeats and his poems as an effective tool to do that, to help people who maybe don't know Ireland so well to get to know Ireland?
Yeah, I mean, I've met people all over the world who have no ancestral connection with Ireland, right? But for whom somehow Yeats is a way that they have taken on, which draws them into Ireland. They may have read his poetry and then decide, hey, I've got to go and see this place where this poet came from. In India especially, there was a huge interest in Yeats because he was an advocate for Tagore. He helped to get Tagore the Nobel Prize in 1912, I think it was. Mm-hmm. Indians still remember that in the 1980s when I was there. The fact that he was a nationalist made a big difference for many Indians as well. And I remember once going to the All India English Teachers Annual Conference, where I was asked to speak at the plenary session in front of 2,000 teachers from all over India. And I was a keynote speaker, and the other keynote speaker was a man called Karan Singh, who was at that time the Minister for Education of the government of India, but was also the titular Maharaja of Kashmir. His father had been the last Maharaja of Kashmir before independence. And he was a grandee. He'd been educated in Britain. And honestly, his lecture was pretty much composed of long quotations from Yeats. He used Yeats to illustrate his points about poetry and language. And it was a magnificent piece of oratory, as far as I could see, with little or nothing in the way of notes. And he spoke for about 40 minutes. And that was another eye-opener for me, to see somebody like that who had a command of literature and for whom Yeats was his gold standard. I also remember when I was ambassador in Malaysia, being at, I think it was probably the last ever non-aligned summit. Because I remember standing in the lobby and suddenly finding myself standing beside Fidel Castro and his bodyguards. And
wow.
Yeah, I think Gaddafi was there as well. I mean, it was a gallery of notables, shall we say. But I think it was Thabo Mbeki, who was then the second president of South Africa after the end of the apartheid regime. He gave a wonderful speech, which was essentially based around Yeats' Second Coming. And I was so impressed by this that I went away that evening and I wrote an essay about this poem. And I sent it into the New Straits Times, who published it the following day. So, Yeats' poetry pops up all over the place. And certainly in America, I would say the Joyce industry is stronger than the Yeats industry, because I've seen more copies of Ulysses, the first edition from Paris in 1922 in America, than I will see ever again in my life. Some places have multiple copies of that great book, which is only 1,000 copies ever published. But still, you know, all over America, you know, you go to, you know, rare book collections in libraries in various places, and I've seen there were only 25 copies made of Easter 1916, and I have seen at least a half a dozen of those in American universities. So there is a great interest in Yeats, and you know, I think that our literature is a door opener for us. I remember during the financial crisis of 2008-9, I was ambassador in Germany. Our country was in, you know, difficult situation, 2009, 10, 11. And I remember deciding with my deputy, who's now our ambassador in Mexico, Mae von Heinitz, I remember saying to her, what do we do? And we declared a year of Yeats. And I traveled around universities all over Germany with a little exhibition on Yeats. And I gave this kind of speech to open the exhibition on Yeats and Ireland. And, you know, I would attract hundreds of people would come along to hear a lecture on Yeats. And I would always start my lecture by saying, now, you probably heard about Ireland, and we're in the news for all the wrong reasons at the moment because of the banks and so on. But here's the story of our economy. And I would give them a 3 or 4 minute, you know, quick fix on the Irish economy, basically saying, don't worry, we're going to recover. You know, you haven't lost your money will all be paid back to you. You shouldn't worry about us. We're solid. And that was an important message to be able to get across to a German audience at a time. And I was able to get that across on the back of my ability to go and give lectures on Yeats that would attract significant numbers of Germans all over that country. So those are my and also, and finally, Patrick, I mean, when I was in Britain, 2015, I was thinking, 2016, it's the centenary of the Easter Rising. It would be cowardly to do nothing to commemorate the Easter Rising. But it was obviously a violent uprising against the British state. So there might be sensitivities surrounding it. So I decided to use Easter 1916 as my vehicle for explaining the Easter Rising to British audiences. And I traveled all over the country during 2016, and I never heard a peep from anybody. I remember people in late 2015 saying to me, senior British figures saying to me, we're worried about this Easter Rising centenary may stir things up in Northern Ireland. So I was very conscious of that. I knew it wouldn't happen, but I was conscious that there were fears there. But because I was able to use Easter 1916 as my key text for explaining the rising of the British people, I never heard a sour word from anybody. And that was another way in which Yeats's poetry served me well in my life as an ambassador.
Thank you. We do have questions in chat, but I can't see them, Justina, so I'm sorry.
Okay, because I thought you would read the first one from our friends in Torun.
Okay, well, I have to see it and I can't.
Okay.
Sorry. So so please read it.
So maybe we will ask.
And welcome, dear Professor Buchholz, who is a dear friend from the university.
Professor, maybe you would like to ask questions directly. I think that would be maybe even nicer. But you have to unmute yourself. Nie działa odmutowanie. Dobra. Okay, so I will ask. Okay, so that's the question from Professor Mirosława Buchholz from University in Torun. You probably see it yourself as well.
I can see it. Yeah, it's about it's about the tower. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Look. I mean, I sort of deliberately avoided delving into literary theory in my book. My book is essentially a history book seen through Yeats's eyes and seen through Yeats's work, his poetry, his letters, and his life generally. I tried to avoid getting too deeply into the weeds on Yeats's poetry. But I mean, clearly, the Tower is his most important collection. It has some extraordinarily powerful poems in that collection. And, you know, for me at least, the symbolism of the Tower is the tower that he bought in Ballylee in 1917 and spent most of the 1920s, long summers, living in that tower. And it became, I mean, he wrote to his father to say that, you know, he now had a place where he felt he could age, he could have a solid old age, that it was an old, I mean, obviously he couldn't afford the kind of grand estate that Lady Gregory had, or he couldn't afford what you know, the Gorbus had in Sligo at Lissadell House, but he clearly wanted something solid that he could call his own, and something that could connect with a past that he could then, you know, conjure up, imagine. And it became a very important, I mean, the fact that two of his collections are inspired by the Tower itself, and the winding stair. The winding stair is the stairs that you walk up in Tourballylee to get to the living quarters. So it became a very important place for Yeats, and it became a place where his poetry drew strength from, his experience of living in Tourballylee. I mean, after all, if you think about Meditations in Time of Civil War, which is one of his greatest poems, was written in the Tower. He witnessed the Civil War from his Tower. And so a lot of things in the 1920s that happened to Yeats were connected with his ownership of that property in County Galway.
Okay, the next question, maybe I'll read so all the audience will hear it. Since poetry is not something many young adults pick up on their own, what would be your advice to someone who has just begun their journey with poetry and William Butler Yeats?
Well, I think you'd have to go for one of the early poems, the poems that are more straightforward, easier to manage. But if I had to, so I would suggest the Lake Galavinish Free, When You Were Old, He Wishes for the Clods of Heaven, poems like that, or some of the ballads, maybe, you know, The Fiddler of Dooney, which I think is a lovely ballad, shows that Yeats had a genuine ability to write in the ballad form. And then of the later poems, but not too complicated, I would say The Wild Swans at Cool. The trees are in their autumn beauty, the woodland paths are dry, under the October twilight, the water mirrors a still sky. And that's a poem it's more complex than the early poems. It has more to it than the early poems have, but it's still written in, I think, in a language that's very easy to deal with. There's none of the complexities that the later poems sometimes exhibit, the complexities that are drawn from the automatic writing of his wife George. So those would be my suggestions. Some of the early poems, or The Wild Swans at Cool if you want to go into the later period, but don't want to go too far into the more complicated poems. You know, it's like a practice. It's like a gym. You know, you go in at the beginning and you do 15 minutes on the bike, and then by the time you finish your gym course, you might be doing an hour and a half and doing weights and running and so on, and using many more calories and pushing yourself to a much higher level. That is what I would recommend with Yeats, and with Joyce too, by the way, because with Joyce I recommend when you reach episode 3 of Ulysses, where most people come unstuck, skip it and go on to episode 4 and skip it in order to find the bits. Skip any bits you find difficult and go on to the next episode, because the episodes are not all equally difficult, but some of them definitely are. And I wouldn't want readers to be stalled permanently by reaching a point where they encounter a difficult chapter.
Or just start from Dubliners. No, it's...
Start from Dubliners. Yeah, but if it's even Ulysses, I'd say, you know, I mean, I think in my book, I've given a list of chapters that you can more easily read than the others. Yeah.
What do you think about it, Liliana? A recommendation for your students?
Well, that's a great recommendation. I'm going to use it in all of my classes and all of my seminars. We'll do the gym with Yeats and Joyce, and this is what I'm usually doing. Okay, we have a number of
Yes.
questions. Let's start with the one from Brandon Farrell.
I can see. Okay, Brandon Farrell, congratulations on the book. And after Joyce and Yeats, have you any plans for a book on another Irish writer?
Not yet. I just published this one. I've got to talk to my publisher when I go to Dublin again next month, just to check in with them and see what they think they'd like me to do. I mean, I have some ideas, but one of my ideas is to do something on Charles Stewart Parnell, because he was a political titan, but also a literary icon that both Yeats and Joyce wrote extensively about him. So I'm thinking about maybe delving into the mystery of why Parnell was such an extraordinary political phenomenon during his relatively short lifetime.
But are you going to again not write about his affair, or
well, in the case of Parnell, about his affair, you wouldn't be able to. I also have this. I have this idea that I have this book. I have a book in my head, which is the course I taught at NYU last year was called Literature as History, Ireland 1880 to 1940. And it was tried to be an explanation of why Ireland was transformed during those years, and also why Ireland produced so many great writers at a time when the country was being transformed. So it would be a kind of an extension, really, moving away from Yeats and Joyce and taking in O'Casey and Synge and a few others.
Yeah, that would certainly. But Parnell sounds great. We want these books, so we'll be crossing our fingers that next year we'll have another one and another meeting about such interesting figures. Okay, we do have a thank you note from Professor Wucholt, and then a question from Katarzyna Brown-Bacon. I just don't know, do you want to read it, or?
Yeah, if you want to, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I can.
Yeah, I know you are struggling with. Okay, so I'll do it.
Yes.
Did Yeats consciously contribute to his own rightly personal poetic mythology and celebrity? Purposefully not disproved gossip, initiated some himself, tried to correct beliefs, but needed to accept that even local celebrity status come with a price and is an uncontrollable creator in itself.
I mean, yes. I mean, Yeats, I think, definitely created his persona. I mean, he consciously. If you read his early work, it's all set in Arcadia, and it's all very, very remote from any kind of life of the world. And he purposely decided to be an Irish writer. He decided that was going to be his thing. And he once cynically wrote to Catherine Tynan to say that, writing in an Irish fashion is actually good for your business as well, because, even in England, people will take notice of you because you're a little different from the run-of-the-mill English writer. If you stick to Irish themes, it gives you a certain kind of je ne sais quoi. And then, of course, he went on to do all sorts of things, and getting involved in public life, in running literary societies, in organizing the Abbey Theatre. This was all part of the persona, and the persona, if you like, it's like a work of art. Yeats is like a work of art that he's created over a period of time, and then in the 1920s and 30s, it comes to fruition in the great poems that I mentioned. The Municipal Gallery Revisited, Circus Animals Desertion, where he actually turns his own life and his own circle into the stuff of poetry, which is not easy to do, but Yeats manages to do it in those great poems, which in my view are one of his most significant achievements. So he did. So he was what I like about Yeats is that he was constantly a work in progress. And most writers, at a certain stage, reach a point where they become what they are. and then they don't really change after that. I mean, you think about Wordsworth, for example. Wordsworth was a brilliant poet in his youth, but a crashing bore in his later years.
It's true.
I mean, he rewrote the Prelude and completely wrecked it because he'd become this respectable kind of elder statesman, gentleman figure, and wanted to get rid of some of the things in the early poetry that was maybe embarrassing to him or didn't quite meet his then persona. Whereas Yeats was prepared to write scandalous poems, the Crazy Jane poems are kind of, I mean, they're like sort of, 60s pop poetry or something in a way. They're they've been unhinged really, but so in other words, Yeats was not that personality who kind of reached a certain level and then said, okay, this is me. He was a pilgrim soul for the whole of his life, in my estimation, in my judgment.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And as we had a question from young people, how to deal with Yeats and how to start their journey with Yeats, I would like to show you just an example of what we did this year. Foundation organized 10 years ago our own educational project. It's called Ireland at School. And we work with different schools all over Poland. We have over 400 schools at the moment, both primary and high schools. And we are trying to educate Polish students and give them as many knowledge about Ireland as possible. So Yeats is always there with lessons for small children. We are using his fairy tales with history, of course, his poems dedicated to history, like Eastern Rising. We have even, I've created a lesson dedicated to Valentine's Day. So like the iconic pairs from Ireland. So Yeats is there as well. And this year we organized 2 competitions. The first one was dedicated to creating a poster for centenary. So you can see the winning pictures here. And here as well. The second competition was recitation, and there is a special playlist on our YouTube when you can hear the Yeats poems read in Polish. So that might be interesting to hear. And of course, poetry, well, it is always this question asked at schools during the lesson, what the poem thought while writing this poem, and a whole analysis, which is actually for some of the students quite boring. So we've decided to do it differently. And we asked a couple of years ago our participants of Ireland at School project to translate some of Yeats' poems into a picture. And that was the result. It's kind of like an intersemiotic competition. We did it again this year with Seamus Heaney poetry and Catherine Heaney chose poems for this competition. And this year for Centenary, we produced a very nice set of cards, which were sent like all over the world at this stage, all over Ireland to Yeats, Sligo Society and National Library in Ireland and Cool Park. There was a conference this year for the honorary consulates and ambassadors from all over the world. And because we work closely with the honorary consulate in Poznań, the set of postcards that we produced together was presented as well to President Michael D. Higgins. So we would love to send you one as well. So I will be in touch to ask you for a postal.
Thank you. I will receive them gratefully. They look beautiful. And in fact, there is the Hamilton Gallery in Sligo does something like this every year. They choose a poem and then they get a number of artists to do paintings based on that poem. So yeah, but I mean, these are great. This is great stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for the students, it works really, really well. And the event that Liliana already mentioned on 14th of November, so 100 years after Yeats received the information about Nobel Prize, we organized evening with his poetry in Raczyński Library here in Poznań. That's the oldest public library in Poland. And that's actually a quite historic picture of the library here in the middle, because you can see kind of like a banner with Yeats on it.
I can see it, yes.
And that was the touring exhibition from National Library in Dublin. And we helped Embassy of Ireland back then to organize this tour, and the exhibition was as well in the library. So we have Ambassador Patrick Hockey in a beautiful recitation of Easter 1916. We have the winners of our recitation competition reading poetry live and from recording. So that was a very, very, I think, pleasure and nice evening. Liliana was reading a poem. Liliana, would you say it was Two Scholars?
Yes, it was Two Scholars, because I wanted to remind everybody that we should look around. It's connected with Adam Mickiewicz's poems as well, and it's short, and I thought that I'll read something that is not typically Yeatsian, and it's also the message is that we should look around rather than just look into books and see nothing of the world. And I think Yeats epitomizes that he was bookish enough, but then he also loved life, and so that was my choice.
Yeah,
that
so
Justina didn't approve of, by the way.
No, I was really surprised that you chose actually this one. So we are trying to, through different ways, introduce poetry into the lives of young Polish students.
Yeah, but I'm going to do the gym one now, from now on, from tomorrow onwards, since I'm meeting my master's students tomorrow, and we're going to do the gym with Yeats.
Thank you so much for your time and for all the knowledge that you shared with us.
Very
And
welcome.
for the book,
Anytime you want me to come back and do something again, I'm happy to do it. I always enjoy these kind of conversations, and you get a great
do this.
crowd.
So you have a standing invitation. We'll have to talk about Ulysses.
Okay.
I've become a little bit obsessed with that. So oh yes, I'm sorry.
I'm very glad to hear that. I'm very glad to hear that.
Is a good read. So
sales don't bother me, but what bothers me is responses by people. And when I hear that kind of response, I am greatly pleased, and my heart is lightened, I can tell you now.
Oh yes, so I would love to go back and talk about this book as well.
Anytime.
Both Yeats but also Joyce are always on our minds, and I think we'll come back to that very happily. And if you find the time, well, make time.
Wonderful.
And thank you very much. Congratulations. And you know, on behalf of the Ireland admirers, you know, I thank you so much for this book. It was a brilliant read.
Thank you to Ambassador Hockey for passing my name on to you, because it's been a great joy to have a chance to speak to you, and such a great group of people with a genuine interest in Irish literature. I would go anywhere. I would spend any time that I can, if I have an audience of people who are appreciative of our literature. That's something I've always been personally very committed to, and I'm glad to see that admiration for our literature is strong in Poznan. Thank you.
Oh yes.
Thank you so much. And to all our participants, please remember to follow the Twitter account of our guests. It's really
Danielem Mulhallem. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good night, everyone.
Good
night.